In this video, we will be talking about the Gospels of the New Testament. Let's begin by defining the word gospel. As we talked about last time, gospel literally means good news. It comes from the Greek word euangelion. Literally, eu meaning good, and angelion meaning messenger. Now the word euangelion is not just used for the titles of these texts that we find in the New Testament. The word is also used in the first verse in Mark to refer to Jesus himself, saying, "This is the beginning of the good news." The word is also used in the book of Isaiah as well as other Hebrew Bible texts to refer to Israel being redeemed and returned from exile. Even more surprisingly for some readers, the word euangelion is actually used to refer to the Roman emperor himself, claiming that he is the good news to the world. When we hear the word euangelion in the New Testament sense, it would be understood by the New Testament audience in the first century to refer to the Israelites themselves as well as the Roman emperor, so there would be a lot of connotation along with this word. As we move into talking about the Gospels that we read in the New Testament, we want to understand that these texts are what we would call interpreted history. This is not to say that the texts themselves do not have historical fact in them, but that the authors are not concerned with giving a fact-by-fact presentation of history. As Warren Carter and Amy Jill Levine write, the Gospels are not history in the sense that we use the term today. While they do contain historical elements, there was a man named Jesus, he died on a cross. They are not attempts at objective reporting. Rather, they are partisan, confessional documents designed to instruct readers about the good news of Jesus. Even when they are recounting historical events, they do so in a way that promotes their own agenda, just as does today's media. Readers thus may ask whether Mark is presenting a description of what actually happened, or symbolism, or a moral exemplar, or a combination of these genres." Unquote. This is true not only of the Gospel of Mark, but of the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, John, as well as the extra-canonical Gospels, which we'll look at here in a moment. We want to understand that what we see in the Gospels may very well be historical fact, but not necessarily is. Just like multiple people might see something or hear about something and interpret it and understand it in different ways based on their background, the same is true of what we see in the Gospels. Now I mentioned that there were extra-canonical Gospels, as well as those in the New Testament. Last time we talked about the New Testament canon, including the 4 canonical Gospels. However, there are many more Gospels that we find written by early Christian and Jewish writers. This is a list that is not exhaustive, but contains many of the famous Gospels that we see about Christ. We'll be reading a few of these towards the end of the semester, such as the Gospel of Thomas. What we see here when we weed out some of the non-canonical Gospels, and we'll talk more at the end of the semester about what makes a Gospel canonical or not, is that we're left with these 4, which we'll be talking about in the first couple weeks of this course. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So these are the 4 Gospels that we find in the canonical New Testament. If you'll notice, they're ordered as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, we will be talking about Mark first because it's probably the oldest of the 4 Gospels, which we'll look at here in a moment. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on these texts and some context as we move into talking about them in the next couple weeks. The Gospel of Matthew was probably written around 70 to 110 CE. By most accounts, the author of the Gospel of Matthew was Syrian or writing to a Syrian audience, based on things that he talks about in the text. More than likely, his audience was a group of Jewish Christians, because he addresses concerns that were based on the law that we find in the Torah in the Hebrew Bible. The Gospel of Mark, on the other hand, was probably written in 66 to 70 CE. At this time, the early Christians were facing persecution by the Romans, especially following the Great Fire of 64. More than likely, Mark's Gospel was written to a group of Gentile Christians, though there also may have been some Jewish Christians mixed in as well. Before we move on, let's clarify just a couple things here. When we talk about early Christians, we are talking about people who are probably Jewish or not Jewish. The idea of an established Christian religion like we have in the 21st century did not exist at this point. So when we're talking about Jewish Christians, we're talking about people who were Jewish, culturally and religiously, but were following this new figure Jesus, who they thought embodied the Messiah. On the other hand, we have Gentiles, who were simply non-Jews. These were people who were Roman, Greek, or any other nationality who did not come from a Jewish cultural background. The Gospel of Luke was written between 80 and 110 CE. Again, the Gospel of Luke is concerned with the Roman Empire. And Luke's audience seemed to be Gentile Christians as well. We'll talk about Luke a little bit more next week. Finally, we have the Gospel of John, which you'll notice as we read later on in the semester is quite a bit different from the other Gospels. This Gospel was probably written around 90 CE. There are many debates on where the Gospel was written and who it was written to, but most scholars believe that it was written to the Ephesians. And the group of Ephesians were probably Jewish Christians. So we've talked about the background and context of these four Gospels that we find in the New Testament, but what are they actually about? Now this is a pretty easy answer. Jesus. So the Gospels are concerned with telling the story of Jesus of Nazareth. But when we talk about Jesus, there's some different things that we're going to learn from the Gospels. We're simply learning about Jesus' life and teachings. We see Jesus called several different things throughout the Gospels. He's called the Son of God, the Son of David. David is the King of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. He's called Rabbi, which in Judaism literally means teacher. He's called Christ, and he's called Messiah. Now Christ, or Christos in Greek, is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, or Messiah. Both of these words mean anointed one. What this indicates is that Jesus is supposed to be the chosen or anointed one, just like a king or priest is anointed in the Hebrew Bible. As we move forward, we want to keep these terms in mind, not necessarily that Jesus fulfills Scripture in the way that everybody in the Jewish community expects, but that he is believed to be anointed as a king and or a priest in some way. As I mentioned earlier, the Gospels talk about the life and teachings of Jesus. Now it's important to note that Jesus is not Christian, because he is the founder of Christianity, and because at this point we primarily have Jewish religion and Greco-Roman religion. We don't really talk about Christianity until after the time of the New Testament. What's important is that Jesus is Jewish, and one way to link him with his Jewish ancestors is through the genealogy we see in some of the Gospels. Most notably, we see this in the first chapter of Matthew, which lists who begat who, or who was the father to whom. Now, this genealogy is important for linking Jesus with his Jewish ancestors, particularly notable figures like King David, who is the king of Israel. We also find Jesus' teachings in parables. These are stories that give some kind of moral lesson through human figures. We also find Jesus' teachings of wisdom, such as the Beatitudes, or the Lord's Prayer that he instructs his followers to pray. We also find the miracles of Jesus throughout the Gospels. We'll talk a little bit more about this in this video as well. We find Jesus' disciples. Notably, he has 12 disciples who follow him, but he also has many more who simply aren't named, like we see the 12 disciples. At the end of most of the Gospels, towards the end at least, we see the crucifixion of Christ. This is the moment where Christ is crucified for different reasons depending on the Gospel, but by the Romans and Jewish collaboration. And finally, we see the resurrection of Christ. This is not in all of the Gospels, in the original versions at least, but we do have this notion that Christ is resurrected from the dead. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain what the Gospel means and how New Testament Gospels function, identify some of the Gospels of the New Testament and the Apocrypha, describe the context and dating of the 4 New Testament Gospels, and explain the general narrative of the New Testament.